Okay, so we're doing really well here. Most of the code that we wrote in the last video, we're not actually going to be using in this video, but it's really important for you to understand how you take keyboard inputs from a user. So depending on the game that you wish to create, if you're making something that's like a tic-tac-toe kind of game or a Connect 4 kind of game, you may not need that keyboard input. But if you're making something like Snake or Frogger or maybe even Space Invaders, you will want that keyboard input from your user. So while at the moment our duck will move around using the keys, I'm going to go back to my code and I'm actually just going to comment out all of this window.onKeyUp code that we wrote in the last video. In fact, I'm going to Command X that just to cut it, and I'm going to paste it down here and just make sure, yes, that we've commented all of it out so that we've got it to refer back to later, but it's not getting in the way of us actually building this game. We did make this remove duck function, which will be very handy for us. So let's now look at randomizing where this duck will appear. So what we want to do is we want to kind of make a function that starts our game, that is our actual kind of run game function. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say function run game. Needs parentheses. I don't think this will take any arguments or parameters, but may do. Add some curly brackets for our code block. And what we want to do is we want to kind of pick a random space or a random cell for our duck to appear in. So what we can do is we can say, remove the duck from wherever it is at the moment. So we will use that remove duck function that we had before. And we need to give this the duck position of wherever the duck actually is initialized as. Then we need to kind of choose a new location and update the duck position with that location. So the way that we can do that is we can say duck location, duck position. We're going to set that equal to, and we have looked at this briefly before, but we'll look at it again, to a random place. Now we're going to use math.random. And the way that we create, we get a random number from sort of 0 to a number. And in this instance, we're going from 0 to 100. We need to say math.random multiplied by 100, because if you remember, the math.random will give us a random number between 0 and 1. It will be a floating point number between 0 and 1. So we need to multiply it by 100 to get that kind of within the boundaries that we actually want. The problem with this is it will give us a decimal place, a floating point number when we do that. But of course, our indexes in our cells are all integers. We don't have index 1.5. We only have cell 1 or cell 2. We don't have cell 1.5. So the way that we can do that is we can use math.floor. So I'm just going to wrap this in parentheses, and then we'll use math.floor. And all this will do is it will round that number down to the nearest whole number. Cool, so there we go. We should end up with a random duck position in our 100 different cells. So let's now go ahead and add our duck at that new duck position. So after we've created the grid, I'm just going to remove this add duck here And I'm going to instead say run game. So if I save this now, and we go back to here, oh, fantastic, we've got it appearing in square 99. If I refresh this, it's in square 17. Wonderful. Refresh it again, 23, 17 again, that was lucky, 21, another one, 58, fantastic. We're randomly choosing a cell for our duck to appear in. So if you look, all we've done there is we've removed it from wherever it was initially at, and we'll probably update this to initialize as just 0. We've chosen a random number between 0 and 100, and then we've added duck at that new duck position. Fantastic, that's pretty straightforward, right? So let's now make it so that this happens on a kind of a, it happens every second, let's say, or every 2 seconds, so that it becomes that kind of whack-a-mole of it popping up in a random place. Well, what we can do is we can use something called set interval. Now, we have looked at timers briefly in the past. So what we'll say is set interval, and then this needs a callback function, but of course it can be anonymous. So we'll say parentheses and fat arrow and then curly brackets. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and move this into our set interval. And of course you can highlight it and then click and drag it in. I'm just going to Command Z to undo that. But a nice little shortcut is you can press Alt or Option and just up, and it will move that block of text, that block of programming up for you. Okay, so inside our set interval here as our second argument, of course, we need an amount of milliseconds that this set interval will run. Or it will run it and then wait and then run it and then wait. So let's say we want it to be let's make it really easy to begin with. We're going to make it every 3 seconds. So we need to say in here 3,000. Great, so if we save that now, we get our duck there, and then we get our duck there. Brilliant, 3 seconds later, and oh, it's gone back to 66, and now it's at 28. Excellent, so we're randomly choosing a place for our duck to appear every 3 seconds. Wonderful. I mean, nothing happens when we click on it now, but let's have a look at that now. So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to detect when there is a click on any of the cells. And then if those cells contain, or if that cell contains a duck, then we know that the duck has been clicked. So an easy way to do this would be, whilst we're creating our grid, is to add an event listener onto our cells. So let's just make a click handler for when that happens. So we'll say function handle click, and then curly brackets there, of course. And inside our create grid, or actually let's just put console.log cell clicked. And then inside our create grid for loop, we can then say cell dot, because we want to add the event listener to each cell that we've created every iteration, every time this loops. So we'll say cell.add event listener. The event, of course, will be click, and then the callback function that it will require, we will have as handle click. So it'll be this handle click function up here. Of course, we will get given the event, and that will be the div that's been clicked. So let's just pass that in there anyway. So let's save that and go back to our Whack-A-Duck game. And let's just see, yep, when we click these cells, whether it has a duck in it or not, we are detecting that the cell has been clicked. Fantastic. So in this handle click, what we're going to want is to say, if a duck is clicked, we want to increase the score by 100. Okay, so we don't actually have a score just yet, but let's go ahead and make that. This will of course need to be a let variable because we'll be updating it as the game goes. So we'll say let score equal 0 because that's how we will start the game with no points, and save this. Okay, so down in our handle click, what we can do is we can say if the click event, so if the target of that event, so if the actual div that was clicked, the target of our click event, if the class list of that div contains the class of duck, well then we know that the user has actually clicked that square that has a duck in it. So let's make our code block. And what we can do here is we can say score plus equals 100. Of course, you could do this as 1, 2, 1,000, whatever, however many points you want every time the user gets it correctly. So let's save that and let's see if this works. Let's go back to our game here. Cool. So when we click here, oh, actually, there's no way of us seeing if this works. So what we're going to do is inside here, instead of it saying cell clicked, I'm going to just remove that. And underneath here, I'm going to have it print out the score every time we click. So we'll say console.log our score. And then every time we click, we'll know the score because it will appear in the console. So let's save that. So if I click this, we can still see that our score is 0. But if I click a duck, brilliant, we can see that it's 100. Again, if I click these empty squares, it stays at 100. If I get a duck again, brilliant, it moves to 200. And that's because we're detecting if there is the class of duck on the div that we've clicked, then we increment by 100, but nothing will happen if we don't. Excellent. So let's get rid of that console.log. We know that that score is incrementing as we would expect. So the only thing that we really need to do is let's give the user a limit of the amount of ducks that we will give them to get their final score. So what we can do is we can say in here, inside the set interval here, if we want to kind of say if the total amount of ducks exceeds, say, 9, end the game. Okay, so let's have a little think about what we actually need to do here. So we need some way of ending the game. We need a way of counting how many ducks have appeared. And then once it gets to 9, well, then we need to end that game function. We need to run that end game function. So the easiest way to do this would be we need to create a function for our end game. And I'm just going to make our code block here. And let's plan what this needs to do. So it needs to stop our timer. It needs to remove the ducks from the board. And then it needs to do something by showing the user's score. So in order to stop our timer, we're currently just using this set interval inside the run game. But one way that we can kind of stop this timer outside of our run game function is we can put a timer up here. We can actually save it to a variable. Now this needs to be a let variable, so we can just say let timer. And then down here in our run game, we can say timer equals. And what that does is it will kind of, when this software first loads, timer will be nothing. It will just be an empty variable with nothing in it. But then when the run game function actually runs, timer will then have this set interval object inside it. What that means is we can then access this timer variable from our end game function. So what we can do in here in order to stop our timer is we can use something called clear interval. Now this takes the timer or the set interval that we actually want to clear. So we literally just need to give it timer. So when the end game function runs, we will stop our timer. We can then go ahead and remove duck, like that. Of course, this needs the current position of the duck, so we will say duck position. And then we also need some way of showing the user the score. Now, best practice to do this, you would probably have a H1 or something, or a div that will appear in front of your user. That will be a much nicer way of doing it, but I'm going to be lazy at the moment and we're just going to say alert. And then let's just use some template literals to say your score was or is, and then we will just pass the score variable in here. Okay, so we've written quite a lot of code there without testing it. I understand this, but we're going to test it now, and we can go through line by line in a moment. So if we come back down to our set interval here, what we can do is we could say if the amount of ducks exceeds 9, we can run this function here. Well, we're not remembering how many ducks we actually have given. So again, we're going to need another let variable up here, and we'll say total ducks. And of course, this will initialize at 0 because when the software first loads, there will be no ducks. And every time a duck is added, we should increase this total ducks by 1. Okay, so let's go ahead just in the bottom of here. Let's say total ducks plus plus, because that will increment our amount of ducks by 1. So now, inside our set interval, what we can say is if total ducks is greater than 9, so this will be if it has 10 ducks, we now want to run our end game function. And we don't actually want to run any of this. There's no point running any of this. So what we can do under here, under this end game, is just return. And that will stop our run game function from running. So if we save that now, we're adding duck. Actually, let's make this a little bit quicker. Let's just move this down to maybe half a second, so 500, and save that. So it's moving around, it's moving around, it's moving around. And you see, we get to 10 ducks and we get the alert of your score is 0 because, of course, we didn't click any of them. Excellent. Let's move this back up to something that's a little bit more challenging, say 1500, and save that. And now let's go ahead and click a few of the ducks. And let's just let this play out. Brilliant. Your score is 500. I think that's pretty much our game sorted. I mean, there are a few little things that we can do, such as getting a button to start the game and displaying the score out whenever we click a duck, of course. And we could do all sorts of things like changing the color of the squares on a win and that kind of thing. Have a play with this code and see if you can break it, how you can improve it, and have a bit of a play and kind of bring your creativity into this game.